if there was no limitations on anything, what do you want? Now, we are looking at God's grace through a number of different sermons and really looking at the practical aspect of God's grace and how it can help us to overcome the sin in our lives, but not just that, that when we have this faith in God's grace, and what we have said already about God's grace is that it is His help, it is all of His help and Himself that He gives us in Jesus Christ. And so when we put our trust in His grace, in His promises, that's what God's grace is, His promises, then we not only gain access to the power that He has for us to be able to overcome and be molded into the person that He wants us to be, but we also find full satisfaction for our greatest longings. So, I ask you again, what do you want? If there was no limitations, now I probably am leading you and maybe misleading you in a certain way. But let me ask it this way. If the statement went, if I only had blank, then I would be happy, what would you fill in that blank? Now, we all have wants and desires. And the wants and desires are not wrong in and of themselves. The problem comes when those desires, when those wants become the driving force in our lives. And that leads to covetousness. We don't use that word covetousness very much. Probably just when we're reading through God's Word or in settings like this. I don't think any of us have said, you know what, I coveted last week. We just don't say things that way. But that's truly what we need to see, hopefully what we can see today. It's the danger of covetousness and how God's grace is the answer to that. So I want us to look at the cause, the consequences, and the cure for covetousness. If we think just for a few moments about the cause, if we even think about, okay, well, what are we talking about really when we say that big word, covetousness? Well, if we look at the Hebrew word for it, it says it is a deep desire for, a panting for. The Greek word says it is a strong desire to acquire more and more material possessions or to possess more things than other people have, all irrespective of need. And I draw your attention to that last phrase, irrespective of need, because what that says is, even if I don't need it, I want to have it. I want more. That's this idea of covetousness. And we are told that we must beware of covetousness. In Luke chapter 12, there in this passage, we see that Jesus is talking, and he's been talking about a number of things. One of the things he's been talking about is the value that God has for us. And that how, even if a sparrow falls, God knows about it. And he says, how much more then does God know about us? And so Jesus, picture this, Jesus is talking about all of these things, and this one man sort of interrupts Jesus talking, and he says, "Teacher, would you please tell my brother to divide our inheritance among us?" To which Jesus says, "That's not my job. I'm not the judge. I'm not the arbiter over this." And then he says in verse 15, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Notice Jesus is the one he's telling us, be on guard. against this covetousness. There is this way that covetousness comes and attacks us. And we have to be aware, we have to be awake, we have to be protecting ourselves, if you will, against it. Well, what is it that we're to protect ourselves against? Well, he says that this life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. You see, we have to guard ourselves from thinking that the aim of this life is to work to get more things. Let me ask you, why are you working? Only you can answer that. Now, some of us may say, well, I'm working to provide for my family. And yes, work in and of itself is not bad. What I'm asking is, what is your motivation for working? You see, we may think, well, I really don't have that much compared to my neighbor. I mean, have you seen my neighbor? Oh, man, he's just got all sorts of stuff. I don't have hardly anything. Really, that's all a matter of perspective. Because I would say none of us are living in a shack right now. But what we would do with that is that we sort of blow it off, if you will, and say, well, I don't have what my neighbor has, so yeah, okay, I'll pay attention to covetousness, but it's not really that big of a deal. Paul says this in Colossians chapter 3. He says it's idolatry. He says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Now notice the wording that Paul uses here. He says, put to death, kill these over desires, is really the idea here. And if we look at it, each and every one of these is not, if you will, the desire that is behind this is not wrong. But what has happened with all of these is that they have been twisted out of the normal means by which they can be fulfilled. And so what he is saying here is then this idolatry, or this covetousness has become idolatry. Now, we say, how can covetousness be elevated to the place of God? I think any and every one of us in here would say, I'm not worshiping my stuff. I mean, I'm here today. I'm here honoring God. I don't worship my stuff. But the problem comes when we are seeking to gain our satisfaction from our things. It is the need for more. And you say, why? Why is that? I would venture to say if we drill down to that drive within us, and today I'm speaking to myself just as much as I am speaking to each and every one of you. And I want you to hear that from the standpoint of, I don't want you to say, oh yeah, this lesson is for so-and-so over here. No, this lesson is for us. Because we need to understand the power of God's practical grace in this area in our lives. But why the need for more? If we drill down on that, if we're really honest with ourselves, we can come up with a number of answers. Maybe we say, well, I want to be accepted by others. And so, I need to have more and more stuff just so other people will like me. Or maybe it's a status thing. That we say, you know what? I want, I want people to look at me. And so I want them to envy me. I want them to see all the things that I have. Well, that's pride. We talked about pride a few weeks ago. Maybe it's security. As long as I've got this stuff, I feel secure. Or power, or whatever the case may be. But the problem is that covetousness, that desire for more, secures the affections that are in our heart that are properly designed for God. I say, well, I don't know that I still understand how idolatry and covetousness go together. Let's look at the opposite of covetousness. In 1 Timothy 6, Paul is writing to Timothy here. And he's talking about these people. And in the midst of this, he says there in verse 5, and that these people are doing this, and a constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and depraved of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. Now, there is great gain in godliness with contentment. Now, Paul is making this statement. He says, now, look, there are people there where you are, Timothy. And they are trying to take things, and especially they're trying to take godliness and use it, if you will, to make a buck. They're trying to get gain from godliness. Now, Paul doesn't want Timothy and others who are reading this to get misunderstood. He makes the statement then in verse 6, there is great gain in godliness when it is accompanied with contentment. Contentment, then, is this idea, might say it is self-satisfaction. And by that I mean not that self is doing the satisfying, but what it is saying is that we ourselves have found complete satisfaction. That's contentment. Or we could say it is the sufficiency of the necessities of life. So when we think about this idea of contentment, what we are saying then is the opposite of covetousness is contentment in God. Or we could say it this way. Covetousness is desiring something so much that you lose your contentment in God. That those desires, the longings that you have to be satisfied, that you are searching for that in all of these other things rather than where those desires are to be properly placed, and that is in God and God alone. So that we have removed God from the number one place in our life, and we're searching for other things to fill that role. Now let's look just briefly at the consequences of covetousness. Number one, I would say you will never find satisfaction. Solomon wrote this in Ecclesiastes. He says in chapter 5 and verse 10, he who loves money will never be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. Do you see the irony here? Someone is searching for satisfaction, and they're thinking, I can get satisfaction by getting more money or by getting more stuff. And what Solomon says is, hey, I've been there. I tried it. It didn't work. You're never going to be satisfied with money. You say, well, why? Because it's temporary. Stuff is temporary. I mean, just think about it. You go buy a new car. What happens the moment you drive it off the lot? It's called new car depreciation. Or you go buy clothes. What happens? Well, they decay. And we say, well, wait a minute. But I get joy from these things. Well, you do, but it doesn't last. You see, there's the immediate thrill, and then it fades. And then you're unhappy. And then you have to go find something else to give you that thrill again. And over this cycle goes. And Solomon is writing here, and he says, it's not going to satisfy you. John D. Rockefeller was once interviewed, and the question was put to him, and they said, how much money do you think you need to be happy? His answer was, just a little bit more. Notice, if you will, if you're there in Ecclesiastes 5, drop down to verse 17, because he's still talking about the person who is longing for wealth, who's wanting this money. And he says there, moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. We actually have a real life picture of that. There was a man named Howard Hughes. And in many ways, he did a number of great things that would be touted by our world. But just notice what was written about him. Billionaire Howard Hughes' obsession in life was to have more. He wanted more money, so he parlayed inherited wealth into a $1 billion pile of assets. He wanted more fame, so he went to Hollywood and became a filmmaker and a star. He wanted more sensual pleasures, so he paid handsome sums to indulge in every hedonistic urge. He wanted more thrills, so he designed and built and piloted the fastest aircraft in the world. He wanted more power, so he secretly dealt political favors so skillfully that 2 U.S. presidents became his pawns. All he ever wanted was more. And yet this man ended his life emaciated, colorless, with sunken chest. His fingernails resembled grotesque corkscrews that were inches long. His teeth were black and rotten, and innumerable needle marks from his drug addiction covered his body. He walked around nearly naked most of the time with his beard and hair out of control. He lived in darkness, wore rubber gloves, and sterilized everything in his junk-filled room. He spent most of his time watching old movies and drinking soup. He was so lonely that he talked on the phone for 10 to 15 hours a day. Howard Hughes died weighing 95 pounds, still believing in the myth of more. Solomon was right. You can go after more and more and more, but you're never going to find satisfaction there. Another consequence of covetousness is that it will choke out your desire for God. In the parable that Jesus tells, the parable of the soils, he tells of that one soil of the seed that falls among the thorns. And in Mark chapter 4 and verse 19, Jesus gives the explanation of that part of the parable, and he says, "But the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful." Did you see covetousness in there? He doesn't use the word, but it's there. It's the desire for other things. When we have that, when we long for those things rather than God, he tells us that those things choke out our desire for God. You see, don't think that our desire for God and our desire for other things can coexist together. That's his whole point. He uses that terminology. He says, it chokes it out. It's not like he's sitting there, that they're both there together going, yeah, we can exist. No. We are made such that we have one true pursuit in our life. One ultimate pursuit. We get to decide what that is. We were made to pursue God, but he gives us the choice to pursue one main pursuit in our life. So I can't pursue the things of God and the things of this world. And let that be together. One will choke out the other. He also shows us that it will impale you with many pains. If we were to continue the reading there in chapter 6 of 1 Timothy, Paul is continuing this thought. And he says there, beginning verse 9, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Notice the heart that is seeking these other things, to find contentment in stuff. He says that desire for money or things, it is going to produce all sorts of other evil. It's not saying money itself is evil, but he says that drive, that love that we have of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Think about it. That pursuit destroys relationships. Because what happens? If you have something that I want, over time, you know what happens? I begin to despise you because I don't have what you have. Think about it. One of the top problems in marriages is what? Money. Why? Because two people can't figure out how they want to spend their money. And so there's this back and forth, this tug of war that ruins relationships. Think about it. We lose our common sense when it comes to covetousness. Because we begin to forget about the feelings and the needs of other people, and it's all turned and focused in upon what I want, what I need, so that I can find my satisfaction. But notice here, the greatest loss. He says there, these who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. This is not to say, oh, well, hey, if you go after this, you're just going to have a bad day. That's not what he's talking about. Because notice what he says there in verse 10, that these people who drive after this, who have this craving for more, he says they have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. They have given up their trust in God for other things. And he says that's what causes them to lose eternity. They gave up on the source of life so they could have a passing, fleeting pleasure. And Paul says that pierces them. That word is actually impaled. If you think of a spear and someone is impaled upon the spear, that's the picture that he's talking about here, to try and get us to wake up to this, to say, don't go down this path. These are the consequences of covetousness. But let's look then at the cure for covetousness. We've already said it in many ways. It is contentment with God. Because only God can completely satisfy us. He's the one who made us. He knows what we need. He knows what we long for. And he says, let me give that to you. Notice how David says this in Psalm 16 and verse 11. This is actually a passage that we're going to look at in our Bible class on grace and forgiveness next week. So if you haven't been coming, come and let's look at what this says in more detail. But notice what David says. He says, you will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there is pleasures forever. David does not say, in your presence there's this much joy. In your right hand, there's a dropper full of pleasure. That's not what he says. Notice the wording. David says there is fullness of joy in the presence of God. How much joy do you want? All of us would say, I want to be full of it. God's saying, I've got it. How much pleasure do you want? All of us would say, just back up the truck and keep bringing it on, right? David says, there's a truck that doesn't stop. with God. He continues to give what we need because He knows us. How do we do that? It's by trusting in Him. Trusting in His promises. Trusting that in Him there is fullness of joy and pleasures forever. And the way that we come to know that is through His Word. Notice what the psalmist says in Psalm 119 and verse 36. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. It's there where God shows me who He is that I come to know Him. I come to experience Him. And I can push away that selfish desire for gain. We hold to His promises. Especially this promise in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. And there it says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For He has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? And for so many years, I have read this disjointed. I've read this as in, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Thinking, okay, I just need to be content in my own life. Whatever physical things I have, I need to be content. That's not what this passage says. Notice what is being joined here. He says, you be content with what you have. And then immediately, he goes right in and he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. His point is, you be content with what you have. What do you have? You've got God. You see that? I can be content with God because He is the source of everything. He is the source of life. He is the source of help. He is the source of everything that I need if I will trust Him. And lastly, contentment is learned, not possessed. I'm not going to be able to go flip a switch and say, wow, I'm content. It doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way for the Apostle Paul as he is writing there in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Paul says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. And I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. Contentment, independent of our circumstances, does not come naturally. Think about it. If you really drill down on, the idea of happiness, it comes from what happens to you. It's based on our circumstances. Paul is saying, I have had to learn to be content with God, independent of my circumstances. You say, well, how does that happen? Well, it happens through our life circumstances. Because there will be times where God says, I want to see if I'm enough for you or not. So I'm going to take everything else away, even your own strength. That's what Paul went through. So that he would say, I can only depend on God to get me through this. So that whether he was hungry or had an abundance, he could say, I'm content because I've got God. And that's all I need. You see, here then is the real answer to covetousness. Paul says it in verse 13. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. That is God's grace. He doesn't put a qualifier on that and say, I can do some things, but the other things I have to figure out on my own. Paul says, I can do all things because I have the strength of Jesus Christ working in my life. So this morning I ask you, what do you really want? Do you want God and nothing but Him? Or is your answer still, I want something else? He gives you that choice. You can go one of two ways. He's not going to stop you. But you're only going to find satisfaction in Him and in His grace. This morning, are you trusting in God's grace? Or are you trusting in the things of this world? Do you have a desire for God? Or is your desire for the things of this world? God is calling you. We can help you, but whether praying with you, or maybe you need to turn your life around and come and be His child and find the grace that goes beyond all that you can imagine. Won't you come? Together we stand and sing.